Yeah, I think we should get started. So if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. I want to take just a real quick minute here at the beginning of the program to say hello and welcome. For those of you I know, great to see so many familiar faces today on our call. And for those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Danielle Bubness. I'm the Senior Director of Grassroots Advocacy at LLS in our Office of Public Policy. And really am just so grateful that you all took the time out today to join us. And really on behalf of our entire team at LLS, I want to welcome you to our first LLS Grassroots Advocacy Academy program. And we've really designed this program today, Building Power Through Effective Storytelling, to really help you take your storytelling skills to the next level. I know many of you have been doing this. Maybe for some of you, this is new, but we really want to continue to support you as you grow these skills, really that you'll need to leverage to help change policy. So today, our speaker, our featured trainer, will share insights into the components of a powerful story. She'll talk about techniques to help you craft and deliver different versions of your story. And all in all, make sure that we're doing this effectively and succinctly, again, to support the overall goal of supporting policy change. So I want to talk for just a few sentences about the LLS Grassroots Advocacy Academy that I mentioned earlier. And really over the next months and into the next year, you're going to be hearing more about, I would say, our renewed commitment to continuing to provide you, our grassroots advocacy community, with skills, training, tools, everything that you'll need to ensure that you're well positioned to help our team about the policy changes that patients need and deserve. And so this training today is the first of just many. Our goal of the Academy really is to develop a powerful group of skilled volunteers who are committed and prepared to move LLS's policy goals forward. And so we couldn't do that without all of you today. We'll be introducing many more programs and content in different formats, whether it be video, live trainings, written materials. And so I hope you're as excited as we are to see what's to come. We're really excited about it. But before I pivot and turn our program over today to our featured speaker, Molly Daniels, I want to take just a minute for a few housekeeping items. So first things first, if you wouldn't mind changing your profile name so that it lists your full name and also the state that you're from, that will just help us as we're doing breakout rooms later in the program. Second thing, we're not going to be taking a break today. So if you need to step away, if you need to get a glass of water, use the restroom, put yourself on mute, turn your camera off, feel free to step away and just join us as quickly as possible so you don't miss out on too much. Third, I would encourage you to use the chat function. I know many of you, you're not unfamiliar to the chat function, so feel free to chat with each other, put your questions in the chat. There are some staff from the advocacy team that are going to be watching the chat and making sure that your questions get answered. So please go ahead and get familiar with the function. And then the last two things I want to mention, just to minimize background noise, if you can mute yourself, that'll just help with the distractions. There will be a time, several times later in the program, we'll ask you to come off mute. But until then, go ahead and mute yourself. Keep your cameras on so we can see you, but the muting will just help with the background distractions. And lastly, we will be recording today. So we'll have this recording available if you want to replay it. And also for folks that weren't able to join us today, we'll have this recording available. Oh, and the last thing I want to mention before I go ahead and introduce our speaker today, you'll see some familiar faces on the call today. Several of the OPP staff are joining us. Danielle, Oswald Toll, and Carmen Burke from the advocacy team are on the line. So feel free to say hi and give them a shout out in the chat box. But really just here for support today. So thanks everyone for joining. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our featured speaker today, Molly Daniels. And it really is a privilege to have Molly with us today. And I think I can safely call her a friend.
Thank you.
Together. We've been working together for quite some time now. Molly's presented for us in the past. We've been working with her and Dan Smith from Advocacy Smiths to really develop the content of this training program that we're putting together. And so really have spent some great time together, and I'm looking forward to the program today. But I want to take just a few minutes and introduce Molly to you all formally, because we really are privileged to have her with us. So currently, Molly is a strategic advisor to Advocacy Smiths. And if you have a chance to read her bio, there's all of these great and really appropriate adjectives to describe her. I love them. Read them. A deft strategist, a consensus builder, an inspirational leader, all true. But really, all in all, she has nearly 30 years of experience in training, organizing, and mobilizing grassroots. So we couldn't have a more experienced trainer with us today. And so thank you, Molly, for joining us. Before she was with Advocacy Smiths, she was the Chief Advocacy Officer of the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. And she was there for 15 years. And in that, actually in many roles at ACSCAN, she led the launch, the buildup, and also the transformation of the entire grassroots network into a national movement of nearly 1 million advocates. It's a really huge accomplishment. And in that time, she created a new grassroots model with a core of 536 highly trained and motivated volunteer leaders. And I wanted to point that out because that's, exactly what you all are. You are our leaders at LLS, and who better to come and train about organizing and storytelling than Molly, who did this in her past life. Molly was named Chief Advocacy Officer after working as the Deputy President at ACSCAN, where she integrated the Society's federal, state, and local advocacy programs seamlessly into ACSCAN. She expanded from a DC-based office of approximately 70 people to a nationwide staff of over 200. And before that, Molly oversaw ACSCAN's work to train and mobilize grassroots volunteers, cultivate leaders, expand partnerships, and impact state and local policy. So really, Molly has done it all. Before coming to ACSCAN, she spent 12 years at AARP as the head of their national grassroots program. And earlier, she ran the volunteer advocacy program for the Older Women's League, as well as legislative campaigns for the Long-Term Care Campaign. And if that wasn't enough, Molly began her career practicing law after receiving her undergraduate degrees from the University of Kansas. So Molly, thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing all of that experience and knowledge with us and with our advocates. Really looking forward to the time we have together. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Danielle. That was very generous, and you made me sound much more impressive than I really am. Here's what y'all need to know, though. I really believe in the power of volunteers. And if you hear nothing else today, just know that my 30 years has taught me the experience, the passion, compassion, the passion you all bring makes a difference. And we're going to talk very specifically today about how your stories make a difference. So I'm really excited to be with you all. in my role at ACS Can, obviously we spent a lot of time working with LLS, so I kind of feel like, I hope that isn't being too cheeky. And Dan and I are very excited. Dan and I are very excited about what you're building at LLS, and just really impressed with the commitment that Danielle and the team have made to giving you the tools to be effective. And as I said, today we're going to talk about storytelling. So first of all, good afternoon. Although for people like me in Colorado, it's still morning. So good morning. And I just want to thank you for joining us today. We're going to use the next 60 to 90 minutes to help you better understand the elements of an effective story. And that may seem like you just tell your story, but there's some tricks to the trade. And we're going to talk about that today. Our bottom line goal is that you walk away, and I guess since we're not together, I guess what I mean is you sign off from this call feeling much more impressed with the power of your own story, much more cognizant of the effect you can have by sharing your story. And during this session, you're going to have time to work on developing your story, and you're also going to have a chance to practice it with others. So as Danielle said, I've spent the last 30 years training advocates. I started when I was very young, and I've talked to them principally about how to talk to lawmakers, how to use their personal stories to connect the dots for a member of Congress or a state legislator or staff on an issue important to them, to put a face on that issue. And I've watched advocates prepare for meetings for years, and they're nervous and they're intimidated, and they're unsure of what value they might bring to a conversation. I have marveled at the empowerment they felt as they told their story and shared why a piece of legislation could impact their lives, or frankly, the life of someone they loved. So the goal of this training is to help you as LLS advocates become aware of your own power when you share your story with your personal story with policymakers. And it's to help you think through how to share that story succinctly, and to help you understand the components of an effective story. And let me just start off by saying that we're focusing on legislators today, but these principles are also true if you're talking to the media or if you're talking to an audience. How can you craft your story to make it memorable? And just as important, how can you become comfortable with sticking to your talking points? Because sometimes a legislator or a media person will try to knock you off stride. And I'm going to give you a hint how to do that. And it begins with P and it ends with the word practice. I realize that just didn't make sense, but stick with me here. That's why distilling your story to a few sound bites that you're going to stick to no matter what happens in that meeting or in that conversation or in that speech is critical. In most instances, let's face it, and most of you have met with legislators. In most instances, when you meet with a legislator, they're going to be gracious and they're going to let you talk. But you want to be prepared for that rare instance when they talk over you, or they want to change the subject because they know you're going to be requesting their support for something they may not want to support. Now, I'm confident y'all worked on your homework assignment and you spent some time thinking about your own story or the story of someone close to you. We're actually going to let you spend some time revising what you did after we've had a chance to talk together. And then, as I said earlier, you're going to have a chance to practice it with a couple of other volunteers. We're also going to suggest, and this is really important, that you develop several versions of your story. If you only have 60 seconds to talk to someone, what are the most important things to say? If you have 2 minutes, what do you add? And as we just referenced a little bit ago, if you have a chance to make just 3 points, what would they be? So thank you, Danielle, for setting this up as using the chat, because usually I'm in a room with people doing this training and I can read faces and I can see when people are confused or they want to say something. I do not have that luxury today. So please be proactive about going into the chat if you have a question or a comment or you want to share your own experience. And Danielle and DOT are going to be watching so that this is as interactive as we can be, given that we're working with Zoom. Do we have any questions about how to use a chat room, or is everybody good? I'm going to ask for thumbs up if everybody's good on how to put in the chat room. I'm looking for thumbs. I'm seeing thumbs. Okay. So, I'm seeing some graphic thumbs. That's okay. I don't know how to do that. Let me start with a couple of questions. How many of you have shared your story with your family or with an audience? Your blood cancer story. Looks like most of you. How many of you have had a chance to share it with a legislator? Oh man, we've got some real veterans in this group. Can we just spend a couple of minutes and have you share what those experiences were like? And if you're willing to do that, just put it in the chat that you have an experience you'll share, because I think it helps us get it, begin this conversation with some context. What's worked, what hasn't worked. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if anybody's willing to share, we'd love to share. Okay, Keith has shared in your new book. Keith, talk to us for a minute about what your experience was like talking to a legislator. Keith, you're on mute. Can you all hear him? Am I not just?
Okay, all right. I think
go.
I'm unmuted now. Okay. Yeah, I shared my multiple myeloma experience in my most recent book. I have not talked to a legislator yet, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I will say when I'm in front of Senator Warnock or Senator Ossoff or a member of their staff, in terms of making sure that every individual, whether it's, primarily blood cancer, but any individual who needs medical care gets it regardless of their ability to pay, because we are the richest nation in the world, and no one should be denied. And I know it's simplistic to say, but no one should be denied medical care because of their ability to pay. There is, money available. And in my case,
I'm going to jump in there, because you know what? You know how I talked about the 3 or 4 talking points?
yes.
You just nailed them.
Okay.
So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go to a couple other people and we'll get back to you later.
Sure.
Kristen.
Hey everybody, I'm Kristen. I'm from the beautiful great state of Maine, where it is roasting 98 degrees today. So very excited about that. I've had the chance to actually talk to my legislators for the past 4 years, and I've really taken a very personal approach about talking directly, number one, about the financial impacts of what having expensive medications is all about, what that's done to my family. Number two, what we're doing to try to increase the amount of time that we have with my father, who's currently in care right now. And the third part of it is really showing the emotion. I'm a very emotional person, and I play to that strength. And I let them know what it means to me on a personal level. At first, when I started in advocacy work, I was really nervous to share that personal side of myself. I felt like it would be not great to show up with all of that emotion, but instead that's actually turned into one of what I feel is my superpowers when I go and talk to my legislators. So really focusing on all of those three things, which come under the umbrella of deeply sharing what that personal impact is all about. So that's been hugely powerful for me.
And Kristen, let me just jump in there, because what you just said is really important. You said you were nervous to share your story. It's really hard to open up, right? But but did you find it empowering? I'm guessing you and Keith find it empowering when you can do that.
Oh, hugely empowering. It's one of those things where we put a face on the realities of what's happening in terms of cancer care right now. And when I focus on that, and I really work as a team with the OPP team that's there with LLS, then I feel like, we come together and then we're able to really have that strength. So again, once I got through that and I felt comfortable with being that level of vulnerable, that's exactly what I was there for. That was my job. And so I embraced that.
And Myra, you've put in a couple of comments. Can I call on you? Where's
Sure.
Myra?
I was on mute. I wanted to say that this is my third experience with speaking. And I've never really spoken directly to any of our legislatures. It's mostly been their representatives. And I was delighted that they were very familiar with the issues. And this year we had an oncology nurse, which is like me, so we spoke the same language. We had a medical oncologist and a social worker. And to break the ice, we asked them to tell us a little bit about them. And so it really was helpful to know their background. And it was also very helpful to be able to relate to similar occupations. So it was really easy.
Well, and Myra, you know what I'm going to say here, and that is talking to the staff can be just as important, if not more important, than talking to the legislator, because they're the
Yeah.
ones whispering in their ears when they go to get a vote. So it can often, when you're told you're going to be in a meeting with the staff, it can often feel like, ugh. But sometimes I think it's better. And
Those
Dan was a
staffers,
staffer on the Hill, so I know you'll agree with me, Dan. The staff are really crucial to this process.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I was on the Hill for 12 and a half years in a staff role. I was never the elected representative, but the staff are incredibly important, and never be disappointed that you have a staff meeting versus a member meeting, because the staffers are actually helping the member. I was chief of staff to my home state senator for many years and then ran 2 different committees. That staff person is actually, in most cases, the recommender of the decision making. And your personal story makes a huge difference when you share that story. Because the other thing to remember is that that staffer is usually going, and the member are usually going in 30-minute increments or even 15-minute increments all day. And they're hearing lots of people who throw lots of facts and figures at them. That starts to become almost pablum in your head, having sat on that side of the desk. But when somebody tells me a story and we relate a human story, that actually is memorable. And I'll remember to say to in my case, the senator, I spoke to so-and-so today, and you wouldn't believe what they told me. It really is heard, and it really does have an impact. So just want to share that, but I don't want to agree with Molly wholeheartedly that never be disappointed about a staff meeting. I mean, it's great to talk to the representative. Never want to shortchange that. That's fantastic, but the staff members are equally, well, not equally, but they are incredibly important.
well, I thought it was very, very helpful to know a little bit about their background. So Danielle actually introduced the concept after we introduced ourselves. She asked, tell us a little bit about you. And so I was really able to relax after I knew who I was talking to and what their background was.
Right.
So that would be my big takeaway from the 3 times I've spoken.
That's really helpful. That's super helpful, Myra. The one thing that, and I don't even think I need to share this with you all, but the one caution on this is you just never know how long you're going to have. And sometimes those meetings are going to be really quick. And sometimes you feel like they're settling in for a long conversation. So you just have to be able to read the room and adjust. And that's really the best advice I can give you. And, Danielle from Colorado, yay, Colorado, just put in the chat, it's really good to meet with the same staffers at different events. What's critical about that point is that when you share your story and you start building a relationship with a staffer, it's harder to build a relationship with a legislator, although it can happen, especially on a state level. But when you're building a relationship with a staffer in your state, they will remember you and they will continue to come back to you. And I have seen it happen time and time again. And the one thing I would share that my experience, and again, doing this 30 years, is that most people, the first time they're in a meeting and they're sharing their story, feel a little nervous about it, feel a little vulnerable about it. Inevitably, people come out saying, you know what, that felt good. It felt good not only for me, but for all the people that I'm representing, who think about this issue the same way I did. So thank you so much, y'all, for sharing. That was really helpful. And I hope it gives your colleague advocates some sense of this does get easier. It does feel a little daunting at first, but it really feels like you're making a difference. Okay, I want to introduce you to an LLS advocate named Sam. Sam is not with us, but we're going to share his video real quick, and then we're going to start talking about some key elements of good, effective storytelling. So if we could roll the videotape.
2017, I was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's T-cell lymphoma. For my diagnosis, a bone marrow transplant was truly needed for long-term cure. As I began preparing for my transplant, my insurance company informed me that they would not be covering any of the previous treatment or covering the transplant I so desperately needed. This left me with roughly $800,000 in medical bills and no coverage for a transplant. Instead of planning a life with my fiance, trying to build a small business, I'm up at night worrying about how to pay the next bill and how to avoid bankruptcy. After spending countless hours on the phone with lawyers, friends, family, business people, I was able to figure out a way to purchase a new insurance plan. Don't fall for short-term coverage because it won't be there when you really need it. Share this video and help us defend.
Okay, you guys got this, y'all got the sense of it. Anyone, and maybe somebody saw, but anyone want to guess how long that video was?
60 seconds.
Yep, a little less than 60 seconds. And think about how much we learned about Sam in that period. We learned he was engaged. We learned about his cancer. We learned about the problems he was facing. We learned about how he tried to remedy that situation. This is just a reminder to us that if you really think about how to construct your story, you can say a lot in 54 seconds. And when you think about it, I mean, let me ask you, picture him in a room talking to a legislator. You think that legislator found his story memorable?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And he didn't get emotional about it. He was just matter of fact, but 54 seconds, he was able to put together. I think it's a very good example of how much you can pack into a very short period of time. Any thoughts on that besides, I mean, it's a terrific, as Katina said, it's powerful and moving, and Myra said that's powerful. Any other thoughts before we move on? I think it really encapsulates. Yeah, go ahead.
It's also a presentation that he can expand because he was very concise, but if the time allows, you can just see how he can pad it in a little bit, and especially about the short-term insurance plans. That's so important.
Well, and Pat, what a great segue, because the whole point here is you need to be ready with your quick. And if you realize you can expand and you have longer, you can think about what else you want to add. So that's a very important point that you gleaned out of that. And I want to go back to what Jack said, nothing wrong with being emotional if it doesn't interfere with the message. I totally agree. Yes, I totally agree, Jack. I have been in meetings with advocates where they pulled out pictures of their family members or they carried a picture with them. There's nothing wrong with being emotional because it can have a real powerful impact. The most basic fact is this: humans relate to stories. They make a much bigger impression, and Dan was talking about this, than a handout of facts and figures. And it doesn't mean that facts and figures aren't important, but if you want to make an impression, it's going to be with a story. And I want to share for a minute an example from a campaign I worked on years ago, if y'all don't mind. So many of us from different organizations were working to get the Affordable Care Act passed. And it was complicated, and different groups focused on different aspects of it. And one of the details of that the organization I was working with at the time, ACS CAN, we were focused on the fact that insurance companies were allowed to set a maximum lifetime cap for expenses. So once you hit that cap, this is before the Affordable Care Act. Once you hit that cap, which initially might seem unreachable, there was no more coverage. We had met a young girl named Taylor from Ohio. She had cancer and had had so many operations that she had maxed out on her coverage. She was 10 years old. Now, I'm sure when her family bought that insurance policy, it had $1 million cap. So, you get that, you're like, who's going to max out on this? But because of all her surgeries, they went through that pretty quickly. And this was an issue for many families. Fortunately, Taylor and her mom were comfortable sharing their story because they were hoping it would make a difference. And at first they did local news in Ohio, but as more people heard her story, as more legislators heard her story, the word kept getting out about her, and she was asked to talk to major newspapers, and then she was on one of the major morning programs. Her story made its way to the White House, and they fought to include a provision in the Affordable Care Act, which would take away lifetime maximums. And that's what ended up happening with the Affordable Care Act. And when President Obama did a news conference about the Affordable Care Act, guess who was there right beside him? It was Taylor and her mom. And most of us are not going to be sharing our stories and ending up next to the president. But if your story resonates with a state legislator or a federal legislator or staff, it can have a trajectory you might never anticipate. It can also, as we talked about a minute ago, it can help you build relationships with legislators who may share your story with others. And by sharing your story, you may find that the legislator staff has had their own experience with blood cancer. So even beyond putting a face on an issue, your story may leave a lasting impact in a variety of ways that you can't even anticipate. And I'll say it again, any of us can go into a meeting and share facts and figures, but if I tell my own story and why this legislation makes a big difference in my life, that is going to resonate with a lawmaker. And Dan talked about that. You still need the facts and figures, but the story is the heart of the meeting. It's important to remember that legislators and their staff meet with constituents hour after hour, day after day. What are the meetings that are going to stand out? Those with the heartfelt stories. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can ask any staffer working for a state or federal lawmaker, and Dan has already talked about this. They provide a unique education on an issue, and when you're sharing your story as a constituent, it connects that legislator back home. So regardless of the activities that LLS ask you to engage in as an advocate, they're going to all feature your story. If you're leaving a message in a phone call, that may be brief, and you may just say, I want them to oppose this bill, or I want them to support this bill. But if you're sending an email or talking at a town hall meeting, or if you have a one-on-one meeting in a legislative office, your personal story should be the centerpiece of your talking points. And the story doesn't have to be your own. It can be the story of someone you love. That is just as powerful. So I'm going to ask Danielle to put up the slide. We're going to talk about what are the components of an effective story. And I would love you to put in the chat if there are any parts of this that don't make sense. Think about who your audience is. I know that seems, and again, we're talking about this in terms of legislators, but these are also true when you're talking about media, or you're giving a presentation to an audience. Think about who your audience is. The tricky part is this: you may be going into a meeting with a legislator not knowing if it's going to be the legislator or staff, but just assume that if it's a legislative meeting, you need to plan for a short amount of time. You may be surprised, and that's why we talk about having several versions of your story. You may not have a lot of time, so you want to be able to plan and add and add. It's like rippling layers. Stay on point and stick to your goal. The most disappointed advocates I ever see are the ones that come out of a meeting and say, I really didn't get to say what I wanted to say. He was talking about the new Walmart in town, or he wanted pictures and he wanted to show me around his office. You're going in there for a reason. Stay on point and stick to your goal. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier, having those 3 or 4 points that no matter what happens, you're not leaving that meeting without having shared. You can be emotional, as somebody was saying earlier, but be straightforward, focused on your most important points. And if the bill you're talking about doesn't relate your story, think about somebody else's story. Think about how you can tie that issue to someone else, to your story or someone else you know. And if you are struggling with that, your LLS staff partners will help you think through it. Sometimes sometimes you're talking about a bill and it really doesn't relate to an issue that's very personal to you. There are ways around that. There are ways to talk about people you've met that have that situation, or LLS will help you think about how to talk about it. And then finally, include in your story what the impact of the legislation will be. If you pass this bill, this is what it's going to mean for me or my family. I know that seems very obvious, but I just think those are really important points to think about when you're constructing your story. And again, we're talking to you about constructing several versions of your story. Let me just stop there. Go back to the chat. Any questions about that? Does that make sense to you? Or is there any part of that doesn't ring true? Or for those of you who've already done this, that doesn't ring true?
Hey, Molly, while we're looking at the chat, just a couple of points to add, which just to add on what you said was, I just think it's so important that you be very precise and actually tie what you're talking about to the bill. I met with lots of advocates over the years who didn't do a good job of saying this is why this is important.
Yeah.
And I think that's the level of sophistication that you all bring to these meetings, that you can actually walk into the meeting, your story, and you can say, and this is why this bill is important. I just want to reinforce that. And I also want to reinforce the point about having the layers. Really read your audience and, get your story out early, like be friendly at the beginning of the meeting. There's often a little bit of small talk, that's fine. But sometimes you only get 15 minutes. So you want to make sure that you politely pivot to really love those things, but I know we've got a short amount of time. I want to tell you my story today. I want to tell you why my story is important. And I want to ask you or your boss to actually sign on to this piece of legislation, because I don't want this to happen to me, what happened to me to other people, or what happened to my family member to other people. That's why we're fighting for this. So make those points very quickly. And then if you get more time, because as Molly said, if they settle in, you can really have a long conversation. I also want to pick up, I think it was Myra who said, getting to know a little bit about them is also important. And I think some comments in the chat, almost everyone who you talk to has a cancer story in their family. It's rare that you meet anyone that hasn't been touched by cancer. And so I think that that's also a really important way you can establish. There's other issues where that just isn't true, because it's so esoteric sometimes. But with cancer, you're pretty much hopefully going to be able to establish. And sometimes you can ask folks, have you had kind of any experiences like my family's had with this? And sometimes they'll open up and tell you that. I mean, you don't want to press that too hard because it's obviously private, but that's also another way to do it.
Hey, Dan, I'm wondering if you, Molly, could talk just a few minutes. I love the point that you made about connecting it to an issue. What if someone's story doesn't have that really clear, direct connection to a particular issue? Do you think there's still a way for people to use their story to influence?
I do, but I think I would pick up on what Molly had, and Molly, you should build on this, is that if your story isn't exactly on point, I think then having another story of a person that is on point is really important, because I think that's the critical point. If you're in for a particular piece of legislation, I think you really do have to be on point with the story. So don't feel like you have to walk in and share your story about something that's not related to what that legislation is. And I think oftentimes you guys will go into these meetings in groups. And so if there's one member of your group that has the most powerful story, let that person take the lead on sharing the story. And then you can play a different role, as in the meeting. Maybe you can actually follow up on some of the facts and figures. And we're saying, and Molly's made this point a couple times, but I want to reinforce it. It's not that facts and figures don't matter. You have to have the science and the facts and the figures to back it up. But the story really has the impact. So figure out what role you have. And I think, in the chat, Mary's got, my friend Leora has faced this, being able to reference someone about that. And that's why thinking about these meetings in advance and planning and practicing is really, really important to actually use the time most effectively. You really have to think about the time you get with the legislator or their staff as this really precious moment. And you want to maximize that precious moment with as much impact as you can have. So really plan it out and think about it. And that's the level of sophistication you're all bringing to these meetings that a lot of organizations don't have this kind of training where they can give people this kind of information to really think it through in advance. They walk in and they're kind of a little new to it and they don't really know how to do it. You guys are pros at this, but we just want to continue to sharpen your skills as you move forward.
I have also seen advocates, especially for instance, like providers, talk about people they work with who they've seen suffer with it, or people in a support group. There's usually a way to pull in somebody. And if you're a credible representative of LLS, you're going to be credible when you say, look, I know people who are dealing with this issue. But Dan, I agree with Dan. It's better not to go too far down the road with your story if it's not on point, and just come in with somebody else's. Okay, I think, Barry, did you have a question or just a comment?
I just want to make a comment. My education is in journalism, and we were taught to tell a story like eating an ice cream cone. You put the goodie on the top because before it melts, you want to get it all in. And then you don't really care about the melted stuff in the bottom of the cone if you don't have time to eat it. And I've always remembered that my whole life, start out with the most important stuff and then, add those extra layers if you have time. But if you don't ever get to them, There'll be the secondary or tertiary points that aren't as important as the main one.
Okay, can we steal that? Because that's wonderful.
Yeah,
Okay,
it wasn't
it's
mine
stolen.
originally, so I'm glad to share it.
Oh, that's wonderful, Barry. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. So I can tell by the way y'all are nodding. I can't see everybody, but y'all seem to be, this seems to be making sense to folks, because what we want to do is give you about 5 or 6 minutes. We'll give you 6. We'll be generous here to go back to the version you did as your homework, and see if you want to revise it any. But we'd love you to come out as much as you can get worked on a 60-second version, a 2-minute version, and 3 talking points. Does that assignment make sense? We're going to let you go off by yourself. You can stay on video or you can go off video. Does that assignment make sense to y'all? And come back together, and I'm going to ask a couple of people to share their sound bites. So we'll be back at 1:50. So get working.
Can you put in the chat the 2-minute version, the 60-second, and the points? Is that what we're the
Yeah,
assignment? Can you?
Yeah, it's in the chat
DOT,
now.
yeah, DOT just put it
Oh,
in the
great.
chat
Thank
right
you.
now. Yep.
Thank you.
Anybody? Paige, you are up. Thank you for offering.
So families are already terrified about their diagnosis and if their medication will work. And they do not need the added stress of their insurance denying their oral medications, and that they will just be absolutely unaffordable. And these are life-saving and revolutionary drugs, and you need to help us keep up with the times and pass the Oral Parity Act.
Perfect, Paige. And what I would do is I would almost put that in a little script. And I think you're so close to it. I think that's great. Anybody else willing to share? Nobody wants to come after Paige. I get it, but okay,
Brenda's
Mary.
got her hand up, and Mary.
Mary Doherty,
So
you're on mute, Mary. There we go.
Okay. So I started out with like, what's my focus? So I took as my focus, why more money for research. So my first point is that good patients who follow all the rules and who are healthy don't necessarily have a good outcome. My second point is I lost my husband, Jim. So now it's time to focus on his children. And number 3, we have to think about research for our children and the grandchildren who are going to be facing more and more variations of cancer in the future.
Terrific. I think that's terrific. You got right to the point. You and Paige both did. You got right to the point, and there's no question why this is personal to you and what you think should be done, and that there's a problem that needs to be remedied. I think that's great. Was that helpful to everybody? Okay, because now we're going to the big time. Here's what we're going to do. We are going to divide you into groups of 3. And we are going to ask you to take different roles and move around in that group. And I'll go through it several times just to make sure. One of you is going to be the storyteller, the constituent. One of you is going to be the legislator. And one of you is going to observe and actually make observations. And if you have time, we're going to do this for about 20 minutes. If you have time, we would love each of you to be able to share your top 3 talking points, your 60-second version, and your 2-minute version. And you can do that all at once if you want, or you can, keep going around, but we're just going to have you shift roles. Am I making sense to everybody? So if Mary and Scott and Roberta are in the same breakout room, the first time around, Mary will share her 3 highlights, Roberta will be the legislator, and Scott will make observations. Then the next time around, Roberta will share her 3 highlights, Scott will be the legislator, Mary will be the observer. You see, you're getting it now, aren't you? Okay. And what we'd like to do is we're going to send you off for 20 minutes and it's very cool technology. You're just going to be sent into a room. You don't have to do anything. And then you're going to come back to us when the 20 minutes is up and see how much you can get done. And I'm going to stay in the main room. So if you have any questions, there will be a button that you can click on to say, go to the main room. You can come in and ask me a question. There will also be some staff kind of milling around, not in the physical sense, but you may see some staff pop in. They're just observing. Don't pay any attention to them. Does that make sense? So all you have to do is you're going to be sent. Yeah. Any questions about how the breakouts work? See, and don't you love technology? So, and then we will see you back in about 20 minutes. And we're actually gonna have people share one of their 1 minute or 2 minute stories. Okay. Hope you all are finding this helpful. I think having a chance to practice with your volunteer colleagues is going to make a big difference. So enjoy. We'll see you back in 20. 15 minutes in a breakout room to work on this is truly a teaser. And for the next 15 minutes, you're going to hear from me and others. Hopefully you've gotten the genesis of an idea for how you want to build your stories, but keep working on them and keep practicing on them. And that's not the last time you'll hear that. I also want to remind you of what we will now call the Barry Gore method. And that is, think about the ice cream cone. Think about what are the most important salient points you need? What is the issue? What is the solution? Because you're presumably talking to them about a piece of fix that problem, that issue. And then how does it relate to you? If you can build your story around that, you are golden. And I don't know, Barry, where those pieces fit in your ice cream cone, but they do. And I just want to thank you for the Barry Gore method. Do y'all feel like you made progress starting to think about this?
Definitely.
Yes,
Absolutely.
Anybody willing to share a 60-second version? Anybody willing to share a 60-second version? Okay,
I'll
Roberta, you're up.
Okay, well, let me, because my version was 2.5 minutes, but let's tone it down here. 10 years ago, my husband was diagnosed with myelodysplastic syndrome, which is a blood cancer that affects the red blood cells that the body produces. And I was determined to get assistance, and it was through LLS that I got assistance. Then in February of 2020, I was diagnosed with B-cell lymphoma. And again, it was through LLS that I was able to get assistance. Neither one of us would have been able to afford our treatments or medications. And I've been impacted twice, both as a caregiver and a survivor. However, we were lucky because almost half of cancer patients with high out-of-pocket costs abandoned their cancer treatment because they can't afford it. No cancer patient should ever have to choose between paying their rent and putting food on the table or getting the cancer treatments and medications they need.
Okay, that was terrific. And the one thing I'd add to that, Roberta, is if you were talking to somebody about a specific bill, then I would just add that to the very end of it and say, that's why we're asking you to.
And that was at the end about the Part D Medicare. That was in my original.
I think that was a terrific 60 to 70 seconds. Thank you for sharing.
Okay.
That was great.
Thank you.
And you immediately got to it. You immediately went to here's the problem. And you got my attention. I was paying attention to you. And I think that you just kind of want to grab them. You want to loop them in. And I think you did that very well with how you opened that up. Anybody want to share a longer version? I know somebody wants to share the longer version. I can't see everybody, so.
Molly, Valerie
Valerie says she would.
Yeah.
Valerie, thank you.
Oh, sure. Okay, so I'm going to try to hone this down.
because as I said in my group, I'm a little chatty. And my story takes a whole bunch of turns. So good afternoon. My name is Valerie Taylor. And in April of 2018, I was diagnosed with AML with a life expectancy of less than a year. At that time, it's important to note that I had lost my job as a nurse 11 months prior to my diagnosis and found myself with a cancer diagnosis with no health insurance and no access to Medicaid in my state due to Medicare cuts. As a result of my diagnosis, I had to basically rely on state funding to save my life. And initially, my hospital bills crested over $250,000 for my initial treatment, with recommendations for a transplant for me to survive with a quote of $1 million without complications. I had been denied the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid 4 times because the eligibility in my state had changed to 65 years of age, blind, and deemed disabled by the Social Security Administration. And I didn't fit into any of those buckets. So it took me 8 months to actually secure health insurance to be able to receive cancer treatment. As a result of that, what I resolved for myself was to become my purpose, to become a voice for the voiceless and to advocate for myself, because that's really what it required, me leaving the outpatient chemotherapy for my second phase of treatment and going to the Medicaid office and trying to understand how it is that
I'm doing okay.
we have a safety net for folks like myself. And I'm grateful that I was able to secure health insurance for myself and to survive. But I think about all of those people who were not able to advocate for themselves and who most assuredly are no longer here. How this relates to what I need your help for is cancer legislative must pass asks are vital for the quality of life and survivor of cancer families, because now I'm impacted as a Medicare recipient. Capping and smoothing is the most important thing that I can, present to you as being must pass legislation. If my cancer should relapse, my financial landscape would not allow me to survive because I have no way of securing the medication that I would need to treat my relapsed AML. So I hope that my story resonates with you and that you will think about me when it's time to vote for must pass legislation for blood cancer patients.
What that last line was very terrific. That was great.
Thank you.
I hope you will think of me. What a great way to wrap that up. And I think, Valerie, that was, I think that was terrific and it was compelling. And you're going to have to read the room and build your story so that you have to get through this But it's hard to imagine the legislator cutting you off on that. That's my feeling. That was terrific. But I think what y'all are seeing is if you can get the opening paragraph out and read the room, you can keep adding layers onto it, like Valerie just did. But I would urge you to write this down, practice it in your mirror or practice it with a family member or a neighbor. There is no problem in going into a meeting and reading. If you're just not comfortable memorizing it, there's no issue with you having to look at notes. That's not a problem. But the more you practice it, the more you're going to feel comfortable when you get in front of somebody and you're kind of nervous, especially if it's a legislator. So just think about that. I thought y'all did. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. And the challenge with a training like this is we're just kind of getting the tip of the iceberg. And this training is only going to be effective for you all if you take it and run with it and you think about your talking points and your 30-second version, your 60-second version and your 2-minute version. If you write those all out and you get comfortable saying them and you practice, you will be ready for any situation. Last thoughts before we close up. I think y'all are great. And I hope you have appreciated the importance of crafting your story and preparing it for going into those situations. I want to share with you. Yeah, go ahead, Carmen.
We have one quick question for you.
you know, when we're telling, as an advocate's telling the story, this whole story is important to us. How do we know, how does the advocate know which parts to emphasize for the listener, that they might, you know, kind of emphasize what's the important part of the story? How do we know what to pick out?
Can I piggyback on that before you answer?
Sure,
I was
Jack.
going to say, unless I missed it, it would have been very helpful to me in preparing my story if you had laid out some scenarios of potential things that we were going in to lobby for, that I could customize my story accordingly. Because I just wrote my story as my story without any
Without a
particular
context.
focus.
Yeah. That's totally fair, Jack. And before any meeting you were going into, you would want to step back and say, does my story or does my story align with it? Or do I need to find another way to hook in somebody else's story? I think that's totally fair. And the challenge with doing that is in this kind of a training is you all come into this with different stories. So you know, if it would be helpful, we can actually send out some scenarios for you to practice with. I think that might be a good follow-up. But I think going back to your question, Carmen, I think the bottom line is to think about what is the problem that you're talking to the legislator about? It's the ice cream cone. And I hope it says my internet connection is unstable. What is the problem you're going in to talk about? What is the solution? How does your story relate to that? I think it's really that simple. I don't know if that makes sense to you, Jack, but I think it's trying to align your story with what the issue is. And it's hard when you don't have an issue out there to talk about.
Well, there must be some actual things that we're working on now, right? I mean, I know there are, that we don't have, it doesn't have to be theoretical. We can actually speak to some actual issues that are on the table now.
Jack, or Molly, I'll jump in real quick, and it's a nice segue because before we wrap up, I did want to flag that the storytelling, like I said in the beginning, really is just the first of many, many trainings to come. And next month, we'll be hosting less of a training, but more of a preparation session ahead of August recess visits, where we will be going with a very specific ask, a very specific piece of legislation. So keep your eyes and ears open for information on that meeting next month. But we'll kind of translating everything that we learned today just about storytelling in general and kind of honing it down to being very relatable to a specific issue, so that when in August we're in front of lawmakers, you'll feel ready to make those asks. So more to come.
Thank you, Danielle. And I know that one of the things you're offering to do is, as you think about your personal story, you can send it to the advocacy mailbox, and the staff is willing to look at it and help you kind of massage it, if you will. So think about that as an opportunity.
And that's also a place, Molly, where once we see it, Jack, sometimes we can start to pull out pieces and then figure out which issue it might fit. And actually, I jumped into one of the rooms with Marcel. I don't know if she's still on, but we just started talking about her story, and she was talking about oral parity. And through her story, I could hear that it was also about Medicare Part D. And that's an issue, both oral parity and Medicare Part D are issues we work on. So, as we look at your stories when they come into that email box, or if you want to set up some time to chat, we would love to do that. Then that's when we can really help to start figure out, is it a research funding story? Is it an access to care issue? Is it a Part D issue? So it's a really good point, Jack, and I'm excited for the foundation that was created today. So now we can figure out how we take your stories and transition them to relate to a specific ask. So great job, everyone.
Great job. And let me just share with you one final note of wisdom. How many of you guys took piano lessons as a kid? That either brings back horrible memories or really wonderful memories. It could go either way. I want to finish by sharing it. If you had to practice, you probably hated it. So I just was, I never got to take piano lessons, but I always wanted to. But I had friends who just couldn't stand the piano because they had to stay on the keys all the time. This brings back a story that I share every time I do a training or make a presentation. It happened years ago, but I still get it. I was doing a training with a group of advocates and preparing them for a meeting with a legislator. They were all talking about the different roles they were going to take. And when we got finished and they had decided this person was going to do this and this person was going to do that, I said, okay, let's practice. And somebody actually held up their hand and they said, but if we practice too much, aren't we going to look really organized in that meeting? And I just took a beat and I said, that's just fine. There's a reason we call this organizing, because the more you can organize yourself, whether it's your story or you're meeting in conjunction with other people, with a legislator, the more impact you're going to have. And the legislators really respect organizations that come in really prepared. So don't let being too organized ever bother you. And I just urge you to keep practicing. Just because your story is rehearsed and you've practiced it a lot of time doesn't mean it isn't authentic. So thank you for your time today. As Danielle and Carmen and we're saying, we've tried to talk about this broadly, but this is we're going to really be switching to the practical impact of your stories as you move into talking about very specific legislation. So I wish you all good luck. What I can tell you is I think you're great, and I think your stories are going to make a huge difference, and it's just going to be fun watching what happens with y'all. Any last minute words, Danielle?
No, you did it all. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll be in touch. Please send your stories to the email that Danielle put in the chats. Happy to help you with, just continue to refine those. But looking forward to next month when we do exactly what Jack said, and we really start to hone in on some specific asks for August recess visit. So thanks so much. Have a great day. Happy holiday weekend, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Molly.
Bye-bye.